My mom talks about the fights that she had with
Your
Meri
mom
here and
took you
there.
to fight? Your mom took you to fight?
The financial records just dropped, and they're absolutely wild. But that's not even the biggest bombshell hiding in Christine Brown's world right now. Mykelti Padron just pulled back the curtain on something that makes those sister-wife tensions look like a tea party, and what she revealed about the explosive confrontations between her mother and Meri Brown will change how you see everything that happened in those shared houses. Picture this scene, because it's about to get intense. We're in the Lehi house, and one of Christine's children comes running to their mother in tears. Not just upset tears, but the kind of devastation that comes from being verbally demolished by an adult who should have been protecting them.
Meri, she was a little bit too verbally harsh on one of my siblings, and it was bad. That sibling ended up crying a ton, and they were really sad, and they were really hurt, and they went and told my mom about it.
This child has just been on the receiving end of what Mykelti describes as Meri being a little bit too verbally harsh, and that's putting it mildly considering how traumatized this kid was. Christine's mama bear instincts kicked in immediately. No hesitation, no diplomatic sister-wife discussion, no waiting for Cody to handle it. She marched straight upstairs into Meri's apartment and confronted her face to face. This wasn't their first rodeo either. According to Mykelti, this was the second major "don't talk to my kids again" showdown between these two women, and the tension had been building for years. But here's what makes this revelation so shocking. This wasn't just about one bad day or a misunderstanding between stressed-out mothers. Mykelti describes feeling genuine relief when her mom finally stood up to Meri, saying she was very grateful because it lessened the struggle and backlash she had been experiencing.
And so my mom walked straight upstairs into Meri's apartment, confronted Meri, and that was like the second time that Meri and my mom had had a big, like, don't talk to my kids again kind of thing, which I was very grateful for.
Think about that for a moment. A child was so worn down by ongoing conflict that she celebrated her mother having to storm into another adult's living space to protect her. The phrase "finally make something happen" tells you everything about how long this had been brewing. This wasn't reactive parenting or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was the culmination of a pattern that had been damaging children and forcing mothers into impossible positions where they had to choose between keeping peace and protecting their babies. What Mykelti reveals next is even more disturbing. She admits she remembers far more fights and arguments than her mother discusses in the book, suggesting Christine may have actually downplayed the extent of these conflicts.
Because it kind of lessened a lot of the struggle and strife that I was feeling, the backlash that I was feeling. So I was like, yes, finally, make something happen, take her away.
When a child has clearer memories of family trauma than the adult who wrote an entire book about it, that should tell you something about how deep and frequent these confrontations really were. The most chilling part? Mykelti specifically mentions not wanting to get into crazy details because she doesn't know if all parties involved would be okay with the full truth being revealed. What kind of incidents between adults and children require that level of discretion and protection? What happened in those houses that's still too sensitive to discuss openly, even years later when everyone has escaped the system? This upstairs confrontation moment represents something much larger than two women disagreeing about discipline. It's a window into a toxic family structure where children became casualties in adult power struggles, where mothers had to literally fight to protect their own kids within their supposed family unit, and where the psychological damage was so severe that grown children still carry trauma they're only beginning to unpack. The real question isn't whether Christine and Meri had different parenting styles. The question is how many other confrontations like this happened behind closed doors, and how many children were caught in the crossfire of a system that was never designed to actually protect anyone's best interests. And that's when it got even messier, because this upstairs confrontation wasn't some isolated incident that Christine could write off as a bad day. Mykelti drops another bombshell that completely reshapes how we understand the Brown family dynamics. She reveals that she was consistently singled out as the target of Meri's wrath, describing herself as always a little bit different than the rest of her siblings, and admitting she received a lot of the brunt of Meri and her wrath. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Meri didn't limit her harsh treatment to just one child.
Other spot! Change to you! I like the spot I was in!
You don't get it.
Why not?
Because there's that spot there.
That's my spot.
Mykelti makes it clear that Meri didn't always discriminate, and apparently also took things out on other siblings. So we're not talking about personality clashes or one difficult relationship. We're talking about a systematic pattern where multiple children were subjected to treatment severe enough that decades later, they're still processing the trauma. Think about what it means for a child to identify themselves as receiving the brunt of an adult's anger. Mykelti understood, even as a kid, that she was bearing a disproportionate amount of emotional abuse from someone who was supposed to be a parental figure. She recognized the pattern, accepted it as her reality, and learned to navigate a household where she knew she was the primary target. The specifics of why Mykelti felt different add another layer to this story. She describes herself as more creative, more rebellious, someone who pushed back against cult rules and wanted to wear less modest clothing. In other words, she was showing signs of independent thinking and personal expression in a system designed to crush both. But here's the thing that every woman who's raised a teenager knows: wanting to wear different clothes and testing boundaries is completely normal adolescent behavior. What makes this disturbing is how Mykelti's natural development into her own person apparently triggered such harsh responses from Meri.
Hayden picks on the girls sometimes, which, I don't know. One side I'm kind of like, oh, that means they're integrating really well because he's treating them like sisters. And that's horrible.
We're talking about a child being punished for creativity, for having opinions, for wanting some control over her own appearance. These aren't character flaws requiring correction. These are signs of a healthy young person figuring out who they are. The pattern becomes even clearer when you realize that Christine's other daughters were also testing similar boundaries. Mykelti mentions that Maddie also wanted to wear shorter skirts, but somehow Mykelti bore the brunt of the backlash for this normal teenage behavior. That suggests the issue wasn't really about modesty rules or appropriate clothing. The issue was about power, control, and one adult consistently targeting one specific child. But the most revealing detail comes when Mykelti talks about how grateful she felt when Christine finally confronted Meri. She describes the relief of having the struggle and strife and backlash reduced. Those are not words a child should ever have to use to describe their daily home environment. Struggle, strife, and backlash shouldn't be constants in a kid's life, especially not from adults who are supposed to be providing safety and stability.
Brianna comes up to me and she's screaming at the top of her lungs. She goes, "Peyton hit me in the eye." So we've had some problems with Peyton and Garrison picking on my little kids. Dad.
When Mykelti says she remembers far more fights than her mother discusses in Christine's book, she's telling us that what Christine revealed was actually the sanitized version, the tip of the iceberg. The conflicts that were so severe, even Christine couldn't ignore them, while countless other incidents were normalized, minimized, or forgotten by the adults who should have been protecting these children. This wasn't about different parenting philosophies or household management disagreements. This was about children learning to expect emotional violence as part of their normal routine, and one child in particular learning that she would always be the lightning rod for an adult's unresolved anger and frustration.
Kids have been doing this way too long, way too much, and something needed to be said now. Guys, these are your brothers and sisters whether you like it or not, and you better start treating them like it.
Now here's where the real dysfunction reveals itself, because when you dig into the actual parenting philosophies driving these explosive confrontations, you discover two women operating from completely opposite universes about what childhood should look like. And caught in the middle were kids who never knew which set of rules applied or which adult might snap at them next. Christine describes herself in the book as the kind of mother who believes kids need to be kids. She was fine with children jumping on beds, going through cupboards, playing with Tupperware, making noise, and generally behaving like, well, children. Her philosophy centered around letting kids explore, create messes, and learn through natural play. For any mother who's ever let their toddler empty a kitchen cabinet to bang on pots and pans, this approach sounds perfectly reasonable. Meri, on the other hand, wanted her house maintained in a specific way. She didn't want rowdy behavior. She had clear expectations about noise levels and cleanliness, and she believed in immediate correction when those standards weren't met. For any mother who's ever felt overwhelmed by chaos or needed some sense of control in their living environment, this approach also sounds understandable. But here's where the sister-wife dynamic turned potentially normal parenting differences into a psychological minefield for the children. These weren't two separate households with different rules. These were competing authorities under the same roof, and kids were getting mixed messages that set them up for constant failure and confusion. Picture being 8 years old and doing something that's perfectly acceptable to one mother but completely unacceptable to the other.
There were many other incidents growing up where I was not treated kindly by Meri.
You're not just dealing with typical childhood boundary testing, you're navigating contradictory adult expectations, where success with one parental figure automatically means conflict with another. That's not a family structure. That's a setup for perpetual anxiety and learned helplessness. The Tupperware example perfectly illustrates how innocent childhood behavior became ammunition in adult power struggles. Christine saw a child exploring textures, sounds, and spatial relationships through play. Meri saw destruction of household order and disrespect for property boundaries. Both perspectives have validity in isolation, but when they're forced into the same space with the same children, they create impossible situations. What makes this even more tragic is how the children learn to read these competing expectations and adjust their behavior based on which adult was present. Mykelti describes being different and receiving the brunt of Meri's wrath. But what if she was just being a normal kid who happened to align more naturally with Christine's relaxed parenting style? What if her so-called behavioral problems were actually just her inability to code switch between two completely different sets of adult expectations? The financial reality made this household divide even more devastating. Christine couldn't remove her children from Meri's influence because they literally couldn't afford separate housing. They were trapped in close quarters with incompatible approaches to child rearing, and the children paid the price for adult decisions they had no control over. But the most insidious part of this dynamic was how it taught children that their natural behavior was inherently problematic. When jumping on a bed gets you praise from one mother and punishment from another, you don't learn about boundaries or respect. You learn that your instincts can't be trusted, that adults are unpredictable, and that safety depends on perfectly reading the mood and expectations of whoever happens to be in charge at any given moment. This wasn't about cleanliness versus messiness or structure versus freedom. This was about children learning that their very existence was a source of conflict between the adults responsible for their well-being, and that no matter how they behaved, they were going to disappoint someone who had power over their daily lives. But the real bombshell hiding in this family's dysfunction wasn't just about different household rules or philosophical disagreements. It was about actual violence between children that the adults couldn't agree on how to handle, and what that reveals about these parenting clashes will make your blood boil. Let's talk about Peyton, because his behavior patterns expose exactly how these adult conflicts trickled down and created dangerous situations for the younger, more vulnerable children in the family. We're not talking about typical sibling rivalry or playful roughhousing. We're talking about a pattern of targeted aggression that multiple sources have described as genuine bullying and physical abuse. The camping trip incident stands out as particularly disturbing. Peyton and other older boys were bothering Brianna, who was several years younger and completely unable to defend herself against children twice her size. According to witnesses, one of the boys actually poked Brianna in the eye during this systematic harassment. Picture that scene for a moment. A small girl being physically assaulted by older male children while adults watched, and then those same adults arguing about whether intervention was appropriate. Meri stepped in and told the boys to knock it off, because in her world, physical violence against smaller children was never acceptable, regardless of family dynamics or filming schedules. But Christine got furious with Meri for addressing the situation, claiming it wasn't the right time or place for discipline. Think about that logic. A child is being physically hurt, and the concern becomes about proper protocol rather than immediate protection. This pattern repeated itself over and over. There's another documented incident where Peyton was clearly picking on younger girls, and Christine's response was essentially to normalize the behavior by saying, "That means they're integrating really well because he's treating them like sisters." But treating sisters like punching bags and targets for physical aggression isn't integration. It's abuse being rebranded as family bonding. The most revealing footage shows Brianna running to adults screaming, "Peyton hit me in the eye," while visibly distressed and in pain. This wasn't rough play that went too far. This was deliberate violence against a much smaller child, and instead of immediate consequences for the aggressor, the adults launched into arguments about whose authority took precedence and whether intervention was warranted. What makes this even more disturbing is how Gwendolyn, Peyton's own sister, has publicly described him as the most abusive in the family and refuses to have contact with him because of how physical he became with her. When your own sibling cuts you off completely due to your violent behavior, that suggests a pattern far more serious than typical brother-sister conflicts. But here's where the real dysfunction shows itself. Christine's permissive approach meant that Peyton's aggressive behavior was consistently excused, minimized, or reframed as normal male development. The classic boys will be boys mentality that teaches children that physical intimidation is acceptable if you're bigger and stronger. Meanwhile, his victims were expected to just endure the abuse because addressing it might create conflict between the competing parental authorities. Meri found herself in the impossible position of watching violence unfold and having to choose between protecting vulnerable children or maintaining peace with Christine. When she chose protection, she was accused of overstepping boundaries. When she stayed silent, the abuse continued. Either choice resulted in criticism and conflict, while the actual perpetrator faced minimal consequences. This wasn't about different comfort levels with roughhousing or varying tolerance for childhood energy. This was about one adult consistently failing to protect children from documented physical violence, while another adult was demonized for trying to intervene. And the children caught in this dynamic learned that their safety was less important than adult politics, and that seeking help might actually make their situation worse. The long-term psychological impact of this pattern can't be overstated. Victims learned that adults wouldn't reliably protect them. Perpetrators learned that violence had minimal consequences, and everyone learned that family loyalty meant staying silent about abuse rather than addressing it directly. And that's when the story takes its darkest turn, because what Mykelti revealed on her Patreon about the long-term psychological damage from these household conflicts will absolutely shatter your heart. This isn't just about parenting disagreements anymore. This is about a young woman in her 20s still processing childhood trauma so severe that she describes having suppressed memories from entire periods of her life. Let's be crystal clear about what Mykelti is actually saying here, because the language she uses tells you everything about the severity of what happened in those houses. She specifically states that living with Meri caused her to develop suppressed memories as a coping mechanism. That's not typical childhood forgetfulness or selective memory. That's a documented psychological response to trauma, where the brain literally blocks out experiences that are too overwhelming to process normally. The candy store money incident that sparked one major confrontation wasn't an isolated event in Mykelti's experience. She makes it painfully clear that there were many other incidents growing up where I was not treated kindly by Meri. Very, very many. The repetition in her voice, the emphasis on very, very many, suggests a pattern of mistreatment so consistent that it became the baseline of her childhood experience with this adult. But here's what makes this testimony so devastating. Mykelti describes telling her mother, "We're done," and declaring she didn't want anything to do with Meri after years of accumulated incidents. This wasn't a teenager having a dramatic moment. This was a young person recognizing an abusive pattern and trying to establish boundaries for her own psychological survival. She understood, even as a child, that continued exposure to Meri's treatment was damaging her mental health. The most heartbreaking part, even after Mykelti explicitly told her mother she was done with Meri and didn't want her around, it was still years where Meri would still be very present in our lives. Think about what that means for a child's sense of agency and protection. She identified her abuser, she asked for help, she clearly communicated her needs, and she was still forced into ongoing contact because of the family structure and financial constraints. Mykelti's description of the houses as places where she suppressed more memories because of trauma reveals something crucial about how these living situations affected her developing brain. She wasn't just dealing with occasional conflicts or strict discipline. She was existing in a state of chronic psychological stress, severe enough that her mind had to develop protective mechanisms to function on a daily basis. When someone describes their childhood home using words like trauma, honestly, that's like what it was. They're not being dramatic or seeking attention. They're giving you clinical language that describes genuine psychological injury. Mykelti is telling us that her developmental years were shaped by an environment so harmful that decades later, she's still working to recover memories her brain deemed too dangerous to retain. The compounding effect she describes is particularly crucial to understand. It wasn't one terrible incident that created lasting damage, it was the accumulation of multiple occurrences over years that gradually wore down a child's ability to cope. Each incident built on the previous ones until the psychological load became unbearable and her young brain started shutting down memory formation as a survival strategy. But perhaps the most damning detail is how Mykelti describes years of being trapped in proximity to someone she had identified as harmful to her well-being. Even after she found the courage to speak up, even after she clearly communicated her boundaries, the system prioritized adult relationships and religious obligations over a child's documented psychological safety. This isn't about strict parenting or high expectations. This is about a young woman still working to recover from childhood trauma that was severe enough to alter her brain's normal memory formation processes. And she's sharing this story not for attention or sympathy, but because she's finally in a place where she can begin processing experiences that were too overwhelming to fully remember when they happened. Now here's where this story reveals its most insidious layer. Because Christine knew exactly what was happening to her children, she desperately wanted to protect them, and she was absolutely powerless to remove them from harm's way. What trapped this family in cycles of abuse wasn't just bad personalities or incompatible parenting styles, it was a systematic web of financial dependency and religious manipulation that made escape literally impossible. Christine openly admits in her book that she didn't want Meri around her kids. She recognized the damage being done, she saw the trauma accumulating, and she fought those explosive battles specifically to create some buffer between Meri and her children. But here's the devastating reality that every woman who's ever felt trapped by circumstances will recognize. Wanting to protect your kids and having the power to actually do it are two completely different things. The financial stranglehold was absolute. Christine describes working multiple side jobs just to keep food on the table, but according to Mykelti, they were living in extreme poverty where they didn't always know where their next meal was going to be. Some of the children didn't even have their own beds. When you're struggling to provide basic necessities like food and sleeping arrangements, the luxury of choosing your living situation simply doesn't exist. Think about the psychological torture of watching your children suffer daily harm from someone you can't avoid or exclude from their lives. Christine had to wake up every morning knowing that her kids would be subjected to treatment that was damaging their developing minds, and she had no realistic option to change the situation. That's not parenting. That's being held hostage by poverty while watching your babies pay the price. The religious programming made this financial trap even more devastating. Christine was brainwashed to believe that staying in this toxic situation was actually virtuous, that enduring the suffering was proof of her spiritual commitment, and that Cody represented her path to eternal salvation. The cult messaging told her that protecting her children from abuse was less important than maintaining her celestial marriage. But here's what makes this situation particularly cruel. Christine did try to fight back. She had those explosive confrontations with Meri, she established boundaries where she could, and she repeatedly advocated for her children within the constraints of the system. She wasn't passively allowing abuse to continue, she was doing everything within her extremely limited power to minimize the damage, while trapped in circumstances she couldn't escape. The housing arrangements revealed just how impossible their situation truly was. They lived with Meri in West Jordan, then in Lehi, then various other configurations where proximity was unavoidable. Every time Christine thought she might get some distance for her children's safety, the financial reality forced them back into shared spaces, where the conflicts and trauma continued accumulating. Mykelti's description of years passing where Meri would still be very present in our lives even after trauma was clearly identified shows how the system worked against child protection. It didn't matter that damage was documented, boundaries were requested, and harm was ongoing. The adult obligations and financial constraints took precedence over children's psychological safety every single time. The most heartbreaking aspect is how Christine's protective instincts were systematically undermined by forces beyond her control. She fought for her kids when she could, she absorbed massive amounts of conflict to shield them when possible, and she endured years of explosive arguments specifically to minimize their exposure to harm. But the system was designed to make successful protection impossible, while making mothers feel responsible for their failure to achieve it. What Christine experienced is what countless women in abusive systems understand. You can see the danger clearly. You can want desperately to protect your children. You can fight battles every single day and still be trapped by circumstances that make escape feel impossible. The tragedy isn't that she didn't want to save her kids. The tragedy is that she was systematically prevented from doing so by a web of financial and religious control designed to keep families locked in destructive patterns. But here's where this story gets even more complicated, because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you realize that Meri was also trapped in an impossible situation that would have driven any rational person to the breaking point. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior toward children, but it does reveal how the polygamous system was designed to create conflict and trauma for everyone involved, including the adults. Picture being in Meri's position for a moment and try to understand the psychological pressure cooker she was existing in daily. She's dealing with infertility while watching her husband father children with multiple other women. She's forced to live in close quarters with rival wives and their kids, and she's expected to help parent and financially support children who represent her husband's intimate relationships with other women, while she struggles with her own childlessness. The parenting philosophy conflicts take on a different dimension when you understand that Meri was often the only adult trying to maintain any kind of order or safety standards in chaotic multi-family households. When Christine adopted a kids will be kids approach that allowed behavior like jumping on furniture, going through cabinets, and physical roughhousing, someone still had to deal with the practical consequences of that chaos. Think about watching Peyton repeatedly physically intimidate smaller children while Christine consistently failed to intervene effectively. If you're Meri, you're faced with an impossible choice. Watch vulnerable kids get hurt, or step in and face explosive confrontations for overstepping boundaries. Either choice results in conflict and criticism, but only one choice actually protects the children from immediate physical harm. The financial stress adds another crushing layer to Meri's situation. She's not just managing her own household needs, she's contributing to support children and adults in a system where resources are always stretched thin, and her own emotional needs are completely ignored. She's expected to be selfless and sweet, while watching her husband pour attention and resources into newer relationships that pushed her further into the background. But here's what makes Meri's situation particularly tragic. She couldn't express her frustration or emotional needs without being labeled as jealous, bitter, or failing in her spiritual obligations. The polygamous system demanded that she keep sweet, swallow her pain, and continue functioning as if watching your husband build intimate relationships with other women while you struggle with infertility is perfectly normal and manageable. The different styles of parenting weren't really about household management or discipline philosophies. They were about two women under enormous psychological stress, competing for limited resources and attention, forced to cooperate in child-rearing while dealing with their own unresolved trauma and unmet emotional needs. The children became casualties in conflicts that were really about adult survival in an impossible system. Mary's directness with her emotions, her inability to keep sweet and suppress her feelings, actually reveals mental health compared to adults who successfully buried their authentic responses under layers of religious programming. She was reacting like a human being under intolerable stress, while others learned to numb themselves to survive the system's psychological demands. This doesn't mean that children's trauma isn't real or that harmful behavior toward kids is acceptable, but it does mean that focusing solely on individual personalities misses the larger truth. The polygamous system was designed to create exactly these kinds of conflicts. It pitted women against each other, created impossible parenting situations, and generated trauma for everyone involved while making escape financially and emotionally difficult. The tragedy isn't that Meri was a bad person who chose to hurt children. The tragedy is that an abusive religious system created conditions where psychologically damaged adults were forced to function as parents and caregivers, while dealing with their own unprocessed trauma, financial stress, and emotional neglect. Everyone in that system was being harmed, and that harm inevitably flowed downward to the most vulnerable members of the family. And now we get to the most heartbreaking part of this entire mess, because while the adults were fighting their territorial battles and processing their own trauma, the children were paying a psychological price that's still being calculated decades later. What happened to these kids reveals the true cost of using children as weapons in adult power struggles, and the damage runs so much deeper than anyone wants to admit. The forced integration alone was psychological torture for developing minds. These children were told they were suddenly siblings and expected to bond with strangers who represented their father's betrayal of their original family structure. Imagine being Christine's kids and watching your dad disappear emotionally and physically after Robin joined the family, then being filmed pretending everything was wonderful while your actual lived experience was abandonment and replacement. Mykelti's description of feeling abandoned and losing their father after Robin's arrival exposes how the children understood exactly what was happening, even when the adults pretended otherwise. They weren't fooled by the one big happy family narrative. They could see where dad's attention, affection, and resources were actually flowing, and they were forced to smile for cameras while processing the reality that they were no longer priorities in their father's life. But here's where the damage compounded exponentially. Instead of getting support to process these incredibly complex emotions, the children were expected to perform family harmony for television audiences. They had to suppress their legitimate feelings of abandonment, jealousy, and confusion, because expressing those emotions would disrupt the show's narrative and potentially impact the family's income stream. The bullying incidents between the children weren't random aggression or typical sibling rivalry. They were trauma responses from kids who had no healthy way to process what was happening to their family structure. When Peyton repeatedly targeted smaller children, he was acting out the powerlessness and displacement he felt in his own life. Unfortunately, the adults were too caught up in their own conflicts to recognize these behaviors as cries for help rather than discipline problems. Gwendolyn's complete estrangement from Peyton reveals just how severe the violence became between siblings. When your own sister describes you as the most abusive in the family and cuts off all contact, that suggests trauma responses that escalated into genuinely dangerous patterns. But instead of getting therapeutic intervention, these kids were filmed acting out their psychological damage for public consumption. The most devastating aspect is how the children learned that their emotional safety was always secondary to adult politics and financial considerations. When Mykelti clearly communicated that Meri's treatment was harmful and she needed protection, she was told that maintaining family structures was more important than her psychological well-being. That teaches children that their voices don't matter and that adults can't be trusted to prioritize their safety. Think about the long-term impact of learning that your natural emotional responses to trauma are problems that need to be suppressed rather than needs that deserve attention and care. These children learn to disconnect from their authentic feelings because expressing them created more conflict and instability rather than support and resolution. The financial poverty that Mykelti describes adds another layer of childhood trauma that often gets overlooked in discussions about the family's dynamics. Not knowing where your next meal is coming from or not having your own bed creates chronic stress that affects brain development, emotional regulation, and the ability to feel secure in the world. When you combine food insecurity with family instability and emotional abuse, you're creating perfect conditions for complex trauma. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this entire situation is how the children's trauma became content for public consumption. Their genuine psychological pain, their legitimate responses to an unstable family system, and their developing coping mechanisms were all broadcast for entertainment while they had no power to consent to that exposure or control how their stories were used. Christine's admission that none of her children want to be on the show or watch it tells you everything about how they feel about their childhood experiences being monetized. They can't escape the public documentation of their trauma, and they continue to live with strangers, analyzing and commenting on the most vulnerable moments of their young lives. Now here's the part that should make every viewer's stomach turn. Because while these children were struggling with trauma, abandonment, and psychological abuse, TLC was filming every moment of their pain and packaging it as entertainment for millions of viewers. The network didn't just document this family's dysfunction, they profited from broadcasting child trauma while the kids had absolutely no say in how their stories were used. Think about the grotesque reality of what was actually happening during those filming sessions. Children were processing abandonment, watching their father emotionally disappear, dealing with violence from siblings, and trying to navigate competing adult authorities while cameras captured their most vulnerable moments. Their genuine confusion, hurt, and trauma responses became storylines designed to keep audiences engaged and advertisers happy. The financial incentive created a perverse dynamic where family dysfunction actually became a valuable commodity. The more conflict TLC could capture, the more dramatic the storylines, the more trauma they could document, the more successful the show became. This meant that healing, stability, and child protection were actually bad for business because they would have made for boring television. Christine's recent admission that none of my kids want to be on the show and none of my kids watch it reveals everything about how the children feel about their childhood experiences being monetized. They understand now that their pain was packaged as entertainment, their trauma was used to sell advertisements, and their developmental struggles were broadcast to strangers who felt entitled to judge and analyze their most difficult moments. But the exploitation goes even deeper than just filming trauma as it happened. The show's narrative demanded that family conflicts be resolved within episode timeframes, which meant that genuine healing processes were interrupted or manipulated to create satisfying story arcs. Real therapeutic work takes years, not 42 minutes plus commercials, but the children were expected to perform emotional resolution on television schedules. The most insidious part is how the show's success trapped the family in cycles of dysfunction they might have otherwise addressed privately. When your family's chaos is generating significant income, there's enormous pressure to maintain the drama rather than actually solve the underlying problems. Healing would have meant the end of their financial security, so staying broken became an economic necessity. Consider the psychological impact on children who realize that their emotional pain is literally paying for their food, housing, and basic necessities. They can't separate their trauma from their survival, because the trauma has become the source of family income. That creates impossible loyalty conflicts, where getting better means potentially destroying your family's financial stability. The public commentary adds another layer of ongoing trauma that most viewers don't consider. These children grew up knowing that strangers were analyzing their behavior, judging their responses to family dysfunction, and forming opinions about their character based on moments captured during their most vulnerable developmental years. They couldn't escape public scrutiny, even when they desperately needed privacy to heal. Mykelti's careful language about not wanting to reveal crazy details because she doesn't know if all parties involved would be okay with it shows how the children learned to protect family secrets even when those secrets involved their own abuse. They were trained to prioritize family reputation and show success over their own need for truth-telling and authentic processing of their experiences. The generational impact of this exploitation is still unfolding. These young adults are now processing childhood trauma while navigating public platforms where their healing journeys continue to be scrutinized and monetized. Even their therapy discussions and recovery processes become content for Patreon subscribers and YouTube viewers, which means they can never fully escape the cycle of having their personal growth commodified. But perhaps the most damaging aspect is how the show's success sent a message to the children that their value lay in their ability to generate drama and entertainment rather than in their inherent worth as human beings. They learned that love, attention, and financial security were conditional on their willingness to perform their pain for public consumption rather than on their basic right to safety, privacy, and authentic emotional support. So here we stand, looking at the wreckage of a system that damaged everyone it touched, and the question that haunts every conversation about this family is whether genuine healing is even possible after this level of systematic trauma. The adults are scattered, the children are processing decades of accumulated damage, and the whole mess continues playing out in public, while strangers debate who deserves blame and who deserves sympathy. Christine has escaped the polygamous system and found love with David, but she's still carrying the weight of years when she couldn't protect her children from harm. That kind of maternal guilt doesn't disappear just because you've left the toxic environment. Meri remains in her own complex healing journey, dealing with infertility trauma, years of emotional neglect, and the reality that her responses to impossible circumstances caused genuine harm to children she never intended to hurt. Meanwhile, the children are navigating adult relationships and career decisions while processing childhood experiences that fundamentally shaped their understanding of love, safety, and trust. Mykelti describes needing therapy and having suppressed memories, but she's one of the few Brown children willing to speak openly about the psychological aftermath. How many others are struggling silently with trauma they can't fully access or articulate? The public nature of their healing creates additional complications that most trauma survivors never face. Every step of their recovery process gets analyzed by strangers, and every attempt to establish boundaries gets interpreted as drama rather than necessary self-care. Many family members continue to rely on public interest in their story for income, which means they can't fully step away from the trauma that continues to generate revenue. But here's what gives me hope. They've all proven capable of recognizing toxic patterns and making difficult changes when they have the resources and support to do so. Christine left a system that was destroying her family. The adult children are setting boundaries and seeking therapy. Even Meri has shown moments of genuine self-reflection about her own patterns and triggers. What these family members need most isn't more analysis of who did what to whom, or endless debates about accountability and blame. They need the grace to work through their damage privately, the resources to access quality therapeutic support, and the understanding that healing from systematic trauma is messy, non-linear, and sometimes takes decades to achieve meaningful progress. Every single member of this family was harmed by a system designed to create exactly these kinds of conflicts and trauma responses. The tragedy isn't that some people were victims and others were perpetrators. The tragedy is that a toxic religious framework damaged everyone it touched while making escape and healing extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Do you think genuine healing is possible for family members still navigating public scrutiny while processing private trauma? Which aspects of their recovery journey deserve the most privacy and protection from ongoing analysis? A fresh video is already queued up, and something tells me the next round of Brown family revelations will be even more complex than the last.